Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to discover that every dollar in your bank account, every dollar in your wallet, every dollar you've saved for retirement is suddenly worth half of what it was yesterday. Your $100,000 nest egg is now worth $50,000. Your monthly salary that used to buy groceries for a month now covers 2 weeks. The mortgage payment that seemed manageable yesterday now consumes twice as much of your purchasing power. This isn't science fiction. This isn't some distant theoretical scenario economists debate in ivory towers. This is a mathematical possibility that's happened to major currencies throughout history, and the warning signs suggest America could be next. In 1946, Hungary experienced the worst hyperinflation in recorded history. Prices doubled every 15 hours. By the end, it took 4 followed by 29 zeros Hungarian pengos to equal what 1 pengo had been worth at the start. In 2008, Zimbabwe's currency became so worthless that citizens needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. A $100 trillion bill couldn't pay for a bus ride. These weren't third world economies with weak institutions. These were functioning societies with governments, central banks, and millions of people who went to bed one night believing their money had value and woke up to discover it didn't. The United States dollar has been the world's reserve currency for over 70 years. Every major transaction, from oil purchases to international trade deals, happens in dollars. Central banks around the globe hold dollars as their primary reserve asset. This status has given America extraordinary privileges. We can print money and export inflation to other countries. We can run massive deficits because the world needs our currency. We can sanction other nations by cutting them off from dollar-based payment systems. But privileges can disappear. And when they do, the consequences are swift, brutal, and irreversible. Right now, America faces the perfect storm of conditions that have historically preceded currency collapses. Our national debt exceeds $37 trillion and grows by over $2 trillion annually. Our debt to GDP ratio sits at 132%, higher than any peacetime period in American history. We're printing money faster than our economy grows. Foreign nations are increasingly conducting trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar system that has underpinned our economic dominance. China and Russia are building alternative payment networks. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil payments. The BRICS nations are developing a gold-backed trading currency. The foundation is cracking, and most Americans have no idea what's coming. A 50% overnight dollar devaluation wouldn't happen in isolation. It would be the result of a cascade of events that unfolds faster than policymakers can respond. Perhaps it starts with a major geopolitical crisis that causes foreign investors to dump treasury bonds. Maybe it begins with a revelation about the true state of government finances that destroys confidence in America's ability to service its debt. Or it could be triggered by a cyber attack on the banking system that paralyzes dollar transactions globally. The specific catalyst matters less than understanding the domino effects that would follow. The first domino would be psychological panic. Currency crises are as much about confidence as mathematics. When people lose faith in money, they rush to convert it into real assets before it loses more value. Bank runs become inevitable as depositors demand their money in cash, believing physical dollars might somehow retain more value than digital ones. ATMs would empty within hours. Credit card networks would strain under unprecedented transaction volumes as people desperately try to spend dollars before they depreciate further. The Federal Reserve would face an impossible choice between raising interest rates to defend the currency, which would crash the economy, or keeping rates low and watching the dollar's value evaporate. Import prices would explode immediately. America imports 15% of its total food supply, including 50% of fresh fruit, 20% of vegetables, and nearly all coffee, tea, and cocoa. When the dollar loses half its value, these imports effectively double in price overnight. A $5 bag of coffee becomes $10, a $3 avocado becomes $6. Bananas, which most Americans consider a basic grocery staple, would become luxury items. But the impact goes far beyond exotic foods. America imports crucial agricultural inputs, including fertilizers and farming equipment. Domestic food production costs would spike as farmers face doubled expenses for the chemicals and machinery that make modern agriculture possible. Energy costs would trigger a cascade of price increases throughout the entire economy. Oil is priced globally in dollars, so a 50% dollar devaluation theoretically doubles oil prices for American consumers. A gallon of gas that cost $4 yesterday costs $8 today. But energy touches everything. Transportation costs for moving goods across the country would explode. Heating and cooling homes would become unaffordable for millions of families. The trucking industry, already operating on thin margins, would face bankruptcy as fuel costs exceed what they can charge for shipping. Grocery stores would see their distribution costs double overnight, forcing them to choose between raising food prices further or closing locations. The housing market would experience contradictory forces that would destabilize the entire sector. Mortgage rates would spike as lenders demand higher returns to compensate for currency risk. Rates could easily reach double digits, making home purchases impossible for most Americans. However, existing homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages would find themselves in an unusual position. They could repay their loans with devalued dollars, while their property values appreciate in nominal terms. A house worth $400,000 before the devaluation might be worth $600,000 afterward, simply because dollars are worth less. But this apparent wealth gain would be meaningless if the owner couldn't afford to buy anything else with those devalued dollars. Construction would virtually halt as building materials costs explode. America imports massive quantities of steel, copper, aluminum, and other construction materials. A 50% dollar devaluation would double these costs overnight. Lumber prices, which have already experienced dramatic volatility in recent years, would reach levels that make new construction economically impossible, except for luxury projects. The result would be an immediate housing shortage, as demand remains constant, but new supply disappears. Rental prices would skyrocket as home ownership becomes unattainable for most Americans, creating a cascade of social problems as families are forced into smaller spaces or become homeless entirely. Manufacturing would face an existential crisis. American factories rely heavily on imported components, raw materials, and machinery. The automotive industry, for example, sources parts from dozens of countries. A typical car contains thousands of components, from semiconductors manufactured in Taiwan, to steel produced in China, to rubber from Southeast Asia. When these inputs double in price overnight, car manufacturers face impossible choices. They can absorb the losses and go bankrupt, or they can double their prices and watch demand collapse. The result would be massive layoffs in manufacturing sectors across the country. The technology sector would be devastated. Smartphones, computers, televisions, and appliances rely on components manufactured primarily in Asia. Apple, Microsoft, and other tech giants would see their production costs double while their products become unaffordable for most Americans. The digital infrastructure that Americans take for granted would become increasingly expensive to maintain and upgrade. Internet service providers would face higher costs for imported equipment. Cell phone plans would increase as carriers struggle with equipment costs. The technology gap between America and other nations would widen rapidly as we lose the ability to afford cutting-edge hardware and software. Pharmaceutical supplies would face critical disruptions. America imports 40% of active pharmaceutical ingredients and 80% of finished generic drugs. Doubled import costs would make life-saving medications unaffordable for millions of Americans. Insulin prices, already a source of national controversy, could become truly prohibitive. Cancer treatments, heart medications, and psychiatric drugs would price themselves out of reach for anyone without premium insurance. Hospitals would face impossible decisions about which treatments to offer and which patients to prioritize based purely on economic considerations. The retail sector would experience a complete transformation. Walmart, Target, and other major retailers built their business models around selling cheap imported goods to middle-class Americans. When those goods double in price overnight, the entire retail ecosystem collapses. These companies would face the choice between maintaining their low-price image and going bankrupt, or raising prices and losing their customer base. Small businesses that rely on imported materials or finished goods would fare even worse, lacking the financial resources to weather months of losses while adjusting to new price structures. The employment landscape would transform in ways that would reshape American society permanently. Import-dependent industries would shed millions of jobs within weeks as companies faced input costs they simply couldn't absorb. Electronics retailers would close stores as television and computer sales collapsed. Clothing chains would shutter locations as apparel prices doubled overnight. The automotive sector would announce massive layoffs as car sales plummeted and production became economically unfeasible. But this destruction would create unexpected opportunities in other sectors. Agricultural employment would surge as expensive imported food drove consumers toward domestic alternatives. Farmers who had struggled to compete with cheap imports would suddenly find their products in high demand. However, these farmers would face their own crisis as fertilizers, pesticides, and farming equipment costs doubled. Many would be forced to return to more labor-intensive farming methods, creating jobs but reducing productivity. The result would be higher food prices even for domestically produced goods, as the cost of modern agricultural inputs became prohibitive. Manufacturing jobs would experience a renaissance in certain sectors as imports became uncompetitive. American-made clothing, furniture, and consumer goods would suddenly have massive price advantages over foreign competitors, but this reshoring would take years to develop, requiring new factories, trained workers, and supply chains. In the immediate aftermath of devaluation, the gap between job losses in import-dependent sectors and job creation in domestic manufacturing would create unprecedented unemployment levels. Service sector employment would face mixed outcomes depending on the specific industry. Restaurants would struggle as imported ingredients doubled in price, forcing many to close or dramatically alter their menus. Coffee shops would face existential threats as coffee bean prices exploded. However, domestic services would become relatively more attractive as physical goods became expensive. Hair salons, repair services, and local entertainment would see increased demand as Americans shifted spending away from material goods. The wage dynamics would create social tension, unlike anything America has experienced since the Great Depression. Workers in growing sectors like agriculture and domestic manufacturing would demand higher wages to compensate for doubled living costs. Labor unions would organize massive strikes, arguing that wages must rise with inflation. But employers would resist, knowing that higher wages would make their products uncompetitive, even in the new price environment. The result would be widespread labor unrest, with strikes paralyzing key industries at exactly the moment when the economy needed maximum productivity. Social services would face overwhelming demand just as government revenues collapsed. Unemployment benefits would prove inadequate when living costs had doubled, but benefit levels remained unchanged. Food stamp programs would become meaningless when the stamps couldn't buy enough food to feed families. Medicaid would struggle to cover medical costs that had spiked due to expensive imported medical supplies and equipment. State and local governments would face budget crises as property tax revenues failed to keep pace with their increased costs for fuel, equipment, and imported goods. The healthcare system would experience a crisis that would make previous healthcare debates seem trivial. Hospitals would face impossible decisions about which services to maintain when medical equipment and pharmaceutical costs had doubled. Routine procedures would become luxury services available only to the wealthy. Emergency rooms would overflow with patients who could no longer afford preventive care or prescription medications. Medical tourism would reverse direction, with Americans traveling to other countries for affordable treatment, assuming they could afford the now expensive international travel. Educational institutions would confront fundamental challenges to their operations. Schools and universities that rely on imported technology, from computers to laboratory equipment, would see their costs explode. Textbook prices, already controversial, would become truly prohibitive as paper and printing costs doubled. Universities with large international student populations would see enrollment collapse as the devalued dollar made American education less attractive to foreign students. Meanwhile, domestic students would struggle to afford tuition that hadn't decreased despite the currency crisis. Transportation infrastructure would face systematic breakdown. Airlines would see fuel costs double while international routes became uneconomical due to the weak dollar. Domestic flights would become luxury services as ticket prices spiked. Public transportation systems would struggle with increased fuel and equipment costs, while ridership surged from Americans who could no longer afford cars. Roads and bridges would deteriorate faster as maintenance costs doubled, but government budgets shrank. The psychological impact would prove as devastating as the economic effects. Americans would experience a collective trauma as they watched their life savings lose purchasing power daily. Retirement accounts that had taken decades to build would become inadequate overnight. Parents would face the horrible realization that they couldn't afford to feed their children the same diet they had provided the week before. The American dream of upward mobility would seem like a cruel joke, as middle-class families found themselves unable to afford middle-class lifestyles. Social cohesion would fracture along economic lines. Wealthy Americans who owned real assets like property, gold, or foreign investments would maintain their purchasing power, while middle and lower class Americans saw their savings evaporate. This wealth gap would create resentment and social tension. Neighborhoods would experience dramatic changes as some residents thrived, while others faced financial ruin. The political implications would be severe, with voters demanding immediate action from leaders who would have few good options. Crime rates would spike as economic desperation drove people to illegal activities. Property crimes would increase as families struggled to afford basic necessities. Drug trafficking would expand as the profit margins increased for products that maintained their value better than dollars. Organized crime would flourish in the chaos, offering alternative economic opportunities to people shut out of the legitimate economy. Police departments would face increased demands for services while dealing with their own budget crises caused by expensive fuel and equipment. Regional differences would become stark as some areas adapted better than others. Agricultural regions would fare relatively well as food demand remained constant while import competition disappeared. Manufacturing areas with existing domestic production capabilities would experience renewed prosperity, but service-based metropolitan areas would struggle as their economic advantages evaporated. Coastal cities that had thrived on international trade and finance would face the most severe adjustments as their industries became less relevant in a dollar-weakened world. The federal government would confront policy choices that would reshape America's relationship with the global economy. Emergency measures would become inevitable as social unrest threatened political stability. Price controls would create shortages and black markets. Rationing systems would emerge for essential goods. Import restrictions would protect domestic industries but limit consumer choices. The administration would face pressure to abandon international commitments that had become unaffordable in devalued dollars. International relations would transform overnight as America's economic leverage disappeared. Military bases around the world would become unsustainable as operating costs doubled while the strategic value of maintaining global presence diminished. Defense contractors would face crushing cost increases for imported materials and foreign manufactured components. The Pentagon would confront impossible budget mathematics as fuel costs for ships, aircraft, and vehicles exploded while personnel costs surged to match inflation. America's ability to project power globally would contract rapidly, not by choice, but by economic necessity. Foreign allies would question America's reliability as economic chaos undermined diplomatic commitments. Trade agreements would require renegotiation as American purchasing power collapsed and import relationships became untenable. Countries that had accepted dollars as payment would demand alternative currencies or real assets, accelerating the dollar's decline. The network of international relationships built on economic strength would unravel as other nations recognized that America could no longer afford to maintain its global commitments. Domestic political institutions would face legitimacy crises as voters demanded accountability for policies that led to economic catastrophe. Congressional hearings would focus on blame assignment rather than solutions, paralyzing decision-making at the moment when decisive action was most needed. State governments would consider unprecedented measures, potentially including their own currencies or barter systems, as federal authority weakened. The constitutional framework would strain under pressures it was never designed to handle. Emergency powers would expand rapidly as traditional governance mechanisms proved inadequate for managing economic collapse. Executive orders would replace legislative processes as the need for immediate action overwhelmed democratic deliberation. Civil liberties would face pressure as authorities struggled to maintain order during widespread economic disruption. The balance between security and freedom would shift dramatically as social stability took priority over constitutional niceties. Cultural institutions would adapt or disappear as their funding sources evaporated. Museums would close exhibits, libraries would reduce hours, and community centers would eliminate programs as operational costs doubled while budgets remained static. The entertainment industry would contract as discretionary spending collapsed and production costs exploded. Sports leagues would face fundamental questions about sustainability, as travel costs and imported equipment made current business models impossible. Religious and charitable organizations would experience overwhelming demand for services while facing their own financial crises. Food banks would struggle to source donations as food prices doubled and donor incomes decreased. Homeless shelters would see unprecedented demand while dealing with increased operational costs. Churches and community organizations would become crucial social safety nets as government services proved inadequate, but their capacity would be stretched beyond breaking points. Small businesses would face an extinction event as access to credit disappeared and customers lost purchasing power. Local restaurants would close as ingredient costs doubled and customer traffic evaporated. Retail shops would liquidate inventory at fire sale prices, unable to afford restocking at new wholesale costs. The entrepreneurial ecosystem that had driven American innovation would collapse as risk capital fled to safer assets and business formation became economically impossible for ordinary citizens. Banking institutions would confront systemic threats as loan defaults spiked and depositor confidence collapsed. Regional banks with heavy commercial real estate exposure would fail in clusters as property values crashed relative to mortgage obligations. Credit markets would freeze as lenders struggled to price risk in a rapidly changing currency environment. The financial system that had facilitated American prosperity would require complete reconstruction around new economic realities. Supply chains would fragment as international logistics became uneconomical and domestic alternatives proved inadequate. Just-in-time inventory systems would collapse as transportation costs exploded and delivery schedules became unreliable. Companies would scramble to rebuild local supplier networks that had been dismantled over decades of globalization. The efficiency gains from international trade would reverse rapidly, creating shortages and inefficiencies that would take years to resolve. Technology infrastructure would degrade as maintenance costs exploded and upgrade cycles became unaffordable. Internet service providers would struggle with equipment replacement costs while facing pressure to raise prices that customers couldn't afford. Cell phone networks would experience service degradation as imported equipment became prohibitively expensive. The digital connectivity that Americans considered essential would become intermittent and unreliable. Innovation would stagnate as research and development budgets evaporated and international collaboration became impossible. Universities would eliminate research programs as equipment costs doubled, and graduate student stipends became inadequate for survival. Corporate laboratories would close as companies focused resources on immediate survival rather than future development. The scientific and technological leadership that had defined American prosperity would atrophy rapidly. Environmental challenges would intensify as economic priorities shifted toward immediate survival over long-term sustainability. Renewable energy projects would halt as imported solar panels and wind turbines became unaffordable. Electric vehicle adoption would reverse as battery costs exploded and charging infrastructure became too expensive to maintain. The transition to clean energy would stall indefinitely as fossil fuels became the only economically viable option despite their environmental costs. Agricultural systems would face fundamental restructuring as modern farming methods became uneconomical. Farmers would return to labor-intensive techniques as mechanization became unaffordable and chemical inputs doubled in price. Crop yields would decline as sophisticated agricultural technology became inaccessible. Food security would depend increasingly on local production capabilities rather than global supply chains that had previously ensured abundance. The pharmaceutical industry would fragment as drug development costs exploded and international clinical trials became impossible. Life-saving medications would become rationed as production costs doubled and patent protections became meaningless in collapsed markets. Medical research would halt as laboratory equipment and research materials became unaffordable. The healthcare innovations that had extended American lifespans would become historical curiosities rather than ongoing developments. Transportation networks would experience systematic breakdown as fuel costs made current systems unsustainable. Freight railroads would struggle with doubled energy costs, while shipping volumes collapsed due to reduced economic activity. Trucking companies would declare bankruptcy as operational expenses exceeded revenue possibilities. The logistics networks that had enabled American commerce would require complete reconstruction around new economic constraints. Urban planning would confront obsolescence as assumptions about mobility and commerce proved invalid. Suburban communities designed around cheap transportation would become isolated as commuting became unaffordable. Shopping centers and office complexes would empty as their economic foundations disappeared. City centers would experience population concentration as walking distance became more important than driving convenience. The transformation would be swift, brutal, and irreversible. Within months, America would become a fundamentally different country, forced to rebuild economic systems, social structures, and political institutions around new realities that most citizens had never imagined possible. The society that emerged would bear little resemblance to the America that existed before the dollar's collapse, shaped by scarcity rather than abundance, isolation rather than global integration, and survival rather than prosperity. This wouldn't be a temporary recession followed by recovery, but a permanent restructuring of American life around dramatically reduced economic capabilities and international influence that could never be fully restored. This scenario isn't inevitable, but the warning signs are flashing red. The same conditions that preceded every major currency collapse in history are present in America today. Unsustainable debt levels, reckless monetary policy, declining international confidence, and the emergence of alternative reserve currencies. The question isn't whether these forces will eventually overwhelm the dollar's dominance, but whether Americans will recognize the threat before it's too late to prepare. The transformation we've described would happen faster than most people believe possible. Currency crises don't unfold gradually over years. They explode in days or weeks, leaving entire populations financially devastated before they understand what hit them. The Hungarians didn't see hyperinflation coming until prices were doubling every 15 hours. Zimbabweans didn't expect their currency to become worthless until they needed wheelbarrows of cash for bread. Americans won't see dollar collapse coming until their savings accounts are worth half of what they were the day before. But history also shows us that those who understand these patterns, who recognize the signs, who position themselves correctly, don't just survive these transitions. They emerge stronger, wealthier, and better positioned for the new economic reality. The choice is yours. You can continue believing that America is different, that the dollar's reserve currency status is permanent, that the laws of economics don't apply to us, or you can look at the evidence, understand the patterns, and prepare for what's coming. Because whether you're ready or not, the mathematics of currency collapse don't care about your beliefs, your hopes, or your assumptions. They only care about the inevitable.